Yeah, welcome back. I'm delighted to have you all. I'm very excited to be joined by Andrew Steele, who is the author of this very good book, Ageless, a new science, beg your pardon, of getting older without getting old. So obviously you've been involved in kind of counter-aging, both as a writer and as a scientist. I guess the obvious place to start is how did you first get interested in this subject?
Well, I actually started out as a physicist. I even got as far as doing a PhD in physics. My PhD's in magnets. But toward the end of that PhD, but basically, I'm a very data-driven person because obviously I've got this very numerical sort of physics, hard sciences background, and I actually changed career basically because of a graph, and that graph is your risk of death with time. So if you look at how likely you are to die compared to how old you are, I'm in my 30s, so my risk of death is somewhere around 1 in 1,000 a year.
Yeah.
But if you were to carry on, as I will, hopefully living my life, then your risk of death doubles about every 7 or 8 years. And that means it starts out quite small. Obviously, double 1 in 1,000 is only 1 in 500. So even when I'm in my 40s, things are going to be looking okay. But if I make it as far as my 80th birthday, my odds of not making my 81st are something like 1 in 5. And if you make it to your 90s, then your odds of not making your next birthday is basically like, sorry, I should have said it's about 1 in 20. It's 5%. That's why I got it wrong. And then the odds of not making your next birthday in your 90s about 1 in 6. So it's basically life or death at the roll of a dice. So you see this sort of terrifying exponential increase in the risk of death with age. And what that said to me is, as a physicist, then there must be some process driving this incredible exponential increase in risk of death at a certain time in your life, because it happens to all of us. And so, as a human, you're looking at this thinking, oh, it's a bit terrifying. It's this sort of exponential wall of death coming at me. But as a scientist, you're thinking there must be a process driving this for this to all happen so suddenly at such a similar time in literally every human being. And maybe if we can tackle that thing, obviously that thing is aging, then perhaps we can prevent or delay at least a load of these different age-related killers, things like cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, the biggest killers in the modern world, all of them simultaneously.
I would say one thing that surprised me. I mean, there was lots of things that surprised me about your book in a good way. But I think the first thing that surprised me was just how young the kind of field seemed to be as a serious scientific academic field. Because obviously humans have thought about aging and tried to kind of explain it away for millennia, but that actually sort of having a very serious scientific interest in well stopping it is a remarkably young scientific field. But did that surprise you?
I think it did really, because it's the sort of thing where if obviously I had a physics background, not a biology one, and it's the sort of question that you assume biologists are trying to look into, because obviously everything gets old and dies. We know this, we know our relatives do, we know our pets do, our farm animals do. It seems to be such a universal process, and yet the strange thing is, of course, biologists have been thinking about this for a very long time, but the problem is that a lot of the early thinking about it really suggested there wasn't anything we could do about it, or that it wasn't a very interesting process. So all the evolutionary theories of aging, there was an awful lot of activity trying to work out how aging, which is this sort of gradual process of deterioration, could possibly have evolved, because we know that evolution is survival of the fittest. So why would evolution build animals that age? Well, basically, aging is an evolutionary accident. It's because animals, they're going to die of other things, basically. You can get eaten, you can get a disease, etc., etc. And so if you live in a risky environment, it doesn't pay to invest loads and loads of energy in, creating perfect anti-cancer defenses, which are going to be able to mean that you're cancer-free to the age of 500, if you're going to die at the age of 50, because you're going to get an infectious disease, or you're going to end up just falling off a cliff anyway. And obviously, by the time you've had your kids, you've passed on your genes, evolution doesn't care about you anyway.
Yeah.
And so all of this led biologists to think that aging was effectively an evolutionary accident. It wasn't as though evolution had designed in some sort of ticking time bomb into our genes, and that time bomb just exploded at a certain time, and that perhaps if therefore we could go in and diffuse that time bomb, we could sort out aging. It seemed like it was probably a combination of hundreds or thousands of different processes. So basically, it was just this irreducibly complicated falling apart. We see it happens to the machines all around us, so why shouldn't it happen to organisms as well? And it was only, as you say, very, very recently, it's a very young field, in the sort of 1990s or so, when scientists noticed that there were these single genes that you could change. First, they were looking in worms, because they're a very simple organism to try it out in. But then they later discovered in flies, so insects that are a little bit closer to us on the evolutionary tree, and even in mice, you can change single genes in we in mice have about 20,000 genes inside of us. So you can change just one of those and radically improve the healthy lifespan of an animal. And so, once you had that evidence that it wasn't this irreducibly complicated thing with thousands of competing processes, you really could, go in there and alter a single gene in the lab. Suddenly, this was something that scientists thought, A, was something you could do something about, and most importantly, B, something you can do something about in the lab, in the lifetime of a PhD student. So I think that's what really transformed the field, is the discovery that it's experimentally tractable.
I'm assuming that means it's a field where there's just a huge amount of stuff which hasn't been investigated. I mean, the number of species in the world alone, I kind of get the impression that the number we've actually found out how long they can live for. I mean, because if a field is only a decade old, and you've got species that are longer a decade old, you run into an obvious problem. I mean, assuming there must be so much stuff to potentially look at. It must be a really, really exciting area to be working on.
I really feel that's true. Yeah, I think to talk about species for a minute, just imagine how few aging, so ecologists who are interested in aging there are. In order to determine, so for example, the lifespan of a tortoise, the reason there's a tortoise on the cover of my book is that we think Galapagos tortoises, which that tortoise is one of, are thought to be negligibly senescent. That means they have a risk of death that doesn't change depending on how old they are. And that's really exciting because it shows us that aging isn't a law of biology. So that's why it's such a cool animal. But imagine you're trying to work out whether a particular species is negligibly senescent, or in general just how fast a species ages. If it's a species that lives for for decades or even for centuries, in the case of things like whales and tortoises, imagine the sort of scale of the demographic studies you have to do. You either have to watch a handful of animals for an incredibly long time, or a huge number of animals for at least decades, just to sort of iron out all the kinks in exactly how their survival curve, as it's called, looks. So you can just imagine the sheer amount of effort that would need to be expended. So my guess is that actually aging is far less universal than we think. And if we were just to go out there and look at many, many more animals in the animal kingdom, we'd probably uncover loads of negligibly senescent species that we've just never bothered to do the sort of detailed demographic studies of before. And in terms of the sort of more lab-based stuff, it is on some level really frustrating because there are some things that we could have probably worked out by now. For example, one of the big one of the things that kicked off aging biology back in the 1930s even, and showed us that there was aging wasn't immutable, was that you can do this thing called dietary restriction. You can cut back the food of animals like rats. That was the first experiment. And they cut back their food by about 40%. And what they found was that the rats could live very nearly twice as long. And they weren't just sort of hobbling along in ill health. They were basically slowing aging. They were staying healthier for longer than their compatriots who were allowed to eat what they wanted. And that's a fascinating experiment. And there's this ongoing sort of controversy question about whether this might work in humans. And I could talk for another 20 minutes about that. So let's park that and just say it's not clear whether it's going to work in people. And I'm not yet ready based on 30s. And if this had been a bigger field and people had been more excited about it, we could have already done that dream experiment. We could have watched people for decades as they ate more or less food and tried to work out what effect it has on human lifespan. But because there wasn't that interest in the field, and obviously because that's a very difficult and impractical study in that case, it just hasn't been carried out. But there's so much interesting stuff that we'd love to know what happens over 50 years. And we did have some of the tools in the 70s and 80s to have started these studies, but because it was such a small field, I think there's just so much basic information that we don't know, and it's really frustrating in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, so it's very interesting what you say about dietary stuff, because I mean, obviously, you go online, you find millions of people, well, not millions of people, millions of different diet ideas, some of which are based on fasting to slow down. I mean, my kind of understanding from your book is that there's quite a strong correlation in small animals, but the issue comes when you get to larger animals. Is that kind of a fair summary?
I think so, and even then, that's sort of what I expected to write, actually. But then when I dug into it a bit further, it gets even more complicated because there's dogs, which are quite a big animal in the scheme of things, and they're quite, they live sort of 10 or 15 years, some older dogs. They've only managed to get a 16% lifespan extension in a dog, and yet a rat, you can nearly double its lifespan. Obviously, rats are quite a bit smaller. But then monkeys seem to do better than dogs. So it's just horrendously complicated. I think we're going to, by the time we fully understand all this diet stuff, I honestly think we'll have cured aging medically, because the sort of you just imagine the huge number of permutations there are. You can eat a certain amount of fat, a certain amount of protein, a certain amount of carbohydrates. Where do you get those carbohydrates from? Just the combinations of different foods, and it probably varies at different points in your life as well. There's some evidence that most of us should probably be eating a bit less protein than is normally recommended. It's not entirely clear. I'm not a doctor. I'm not ready to make that recommendation, but that's certainly something scientists are sort of investigating. But in the same study that found that people should be probably eating a bit less protein and eating more plant protein, they found that actually as you get older, I think it was people over the age of about 70 in the study, they were healthier if they ate a bit more protein. And so it really might be that it varies depending on how old you are as well. So just imagine how many variables you've got, thousands of variables in your diet, and then you've got, you can change those at all the different points in your life as well. There probably aren't enough people in the world to properly explore the sort of full space of possible diets. And that's, if you had access to a completely unethical global experiment forcing people to eat things for decades. So it's going to be a long time before we sort this stuff out, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's in some ways reassuring, because it means I can carry on eating what I like without too much kind of concern. One thing I thought was kind of interesting, I mean, because obviously talk about being a very young field, And I got the impression that it's massively taken off in the past few years, or it's attracted. I mean, certainly in terms of public interest. I mean, obviously, there have been a lot of books like your very good book, which kind of, address it to more of a general audience, not just to very scientific people. But is there still a bit of an issue of getting kind of anti-aging taken seriously? So I spoke to Aubrey de Grey, who I know is involved in kind of the same, and he sort of, I said, "Are you being taken seriously?" He's laughed. So, is that kind of an issue that you have as well?
I think there is and there isn't. It's a strange thing. I found one of the reasons I wrote the book is I spent 5 years working as a computational biologist, and I decided that actually what aging needed more than anything else, or aging biology needed specifically, was its profile raising. And the reason I thought that is because even when I spoke to biologists, the people I was working with, a lot of them knew less about aging than I did. And that's not because I'm some kind of savant who came in and revolutionised the field. It's just because I'd done a bit of reading about aging before I started my job. And actually, most biologists, it's not in the textbooks. They probably haven't had a lecture in it as an undergrad unless they happen to have, an aging biology professor at their institution. My wife's a doctor. She's never learned about this stuff. I think when she first met me, she thought I was a bit crazy, banging on about all this kind of thing. But slowly but surely, and the reason the book has got so many references in the back is that to some extent, I don't care if you go away understanding every last single, minutial detail of the science. What I care about is that, this is credible, this is legitimate. There are dozens of different ways to do this. There are, proper scientists at proper institutions all around the world coming up with different ways of slowing and reversing aging. So that's what's really transformed things. And I think if you do present it in this rigorous way, then the evidence is basically irrefutable. I think, as a biologist who knows their stuff, you should eventually look at this and realise that this is something that's really, really important. It's something that's worth doing something about. But the problem is, I can't. I think there's probably a sociology of science PhD in here somewhere, but just trying to dig back through as to why perhaps the low profile of the field, the sort of narrative I present in the book is this idea that because of the evolutionary theories of aging suggesting it wasn't a particularly tractable area for study, that's something that meant it kept a low profile for decades and decades. And then as a result, it never quite gained that critical mass. Because if you imagine something like cancer research, cancer is obviously something that directly kills people. You can say, my parent or my grandparent died of cancer. So if you're a scientist or if you're a politician funding those scientists, you can point at cancer. You can say, that's a thing I would like to cure. Scientists go away and do that. And that field therefore sort of snowballs in a positive sense because, if you're a young undergrad, you go to a cancer research lecture, you have an inspiring lecturer, you might do a PhD in that field. Then what are you going to do your postdoc in? Well, it's going to be cancer research, isn't it? Because you've already got all that knowledge, you've published some papers, you've accumulated a bit of prestige in that field. When you set up your own lab, it's going to be cancer research, isn't it? And when you then lecture your own your cohort of undergrads, you're going to be telling them all how great your cancer research is and all the different techniques that you can use to tackle this incredibly complicated and fascinating disease. So you end up with this sort of vicious or virtuous circle depending on which science you're in. And I think aging biology has never quite gained that critical mass. And so I think there's always been a degree of scientific credibility to it, but it's just required sort of overcoming some sociological barrier where it's been considered for reasons that I can't quite put my finger on, not as mainstream as something like cancer or something like just general cell biology. And I think thankfully now the sheer weight of evidence is pushing some of those credibility issues aside.
Also, I get the impression there's a lot more money flowing into it because I've noticed there's a kind of a whole plethora of startups, many of kind of Silicon Valley links, which are starting to get very serious money and starting to make very serious progress. I mean, is that kind of like an accurate summary?
I think it is and it isn't, and it's a really fascinating sort of weird dichotomy. You're absolutely right. There's a load of commercial venture capital money and that kind of thing because there are now startups and biotech firms and people pharma companies are starting to acquire these biotech startups and so on and so on. This scene is really vibrant, and I think it's a weird we're in a weird situation because there's enough stuff there for adventurous or sort of investors with some foresight to spot the low-hanging fruit, to spot the easy targets that we're starting to understand now and make some serious money out of this. I think some people are going to get rich off the back of these companies. On the other hand, there's that's the tip of the iceberg, and most of the iceberg of aging biology is stuff that isn't quite ready. It's not quite at the point where, as a venture capitalist, I could come in and sink my £100 million investment in and get the wheels of a startup spinning. It's not that these things are decades and decades away from fruition, because if that was the case, I wouldn't be so excited about this stuff. But it's probably the case that they're going to need 5 or 10 years more public funding before they get to the point where you can start to have commercialization or pharma companies stepping in and doing something about it. And so the flip side of that is, while there's all this excitement on the commercial side, if you look on the academic science side, the basic science, the funded by government side of things, the best example I can give actually is the United States. And that's because the US is unusual in having, it's got a government funding body called the NIA, the National Institute of Aging, which is part of their National Institutes of Health. And the first thing to say is that's unusual. Most countries don't have a body specifically devoted to funding aging biology. And that, of course, is a problem in itself. It shows you the sort of low prominence of the field from a public funding perspective. Then if you look at the NIA's funding, it gets about $3.5 billion a year. And that might sound like a lot of money, but then you compare it to the $4 trillion a year that the US spends on healthcare. So that's just to emphasize that that's billion and trillion. So there's a factor of 1,000 difference there before you even start. And actually, there's a running joke in aging biology circles that NIA doesn't stand for National Institute on Aging, it stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's Disease. The reason being that about 2/3 of that NIA money goes to the Division of Neuroscience within the NIA, which is effectively studying Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. So if you drill down into the Division of Aging Biology, the bit that's actually doing the stuff that I care about in my book, that gets about $350 million a year. So that's a bit over $1 per American per year, which is just an incredibly small amount of money when you pit it against the huge healthcare cost of aging. Cancer, heart disease, stroke, dementia, these chronic diseases, they last for years, they sap people's independence, and they just have a huge economic cost associated with them. They cost the American economy trillions every year, and yet you're spending millions, so literally 1 million times less, trying to understand the biology that does something about it. So it's phenomenal how sort of out of whack those two things are. So while there's excitement on the commercial side, there's not enough money flowing in on the public funding side. And that's the thing that I'd really, I'd like to draw the attention of investors to this, because I'd like to see some really sort of big hitting institutional investors getting involved on the investment side. But I think the real growth area now is philanthropic and government funding, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, to try and get some of these projects to the point where the profit-seeking motive can take over.
I mean, it just seems completely counterintuitive that you have any problems at all raising money, in the sense that aging is something that literally everyone suffers. We all know people. Well, we're all aging, but we all know people who are older and who have had a decreased quality of life as a result. We know so many health conditions associated with it. It seems just bizarre to me that you guys aren't just rolling in cash.
It does, doesn't it? And I think there's a real sort of cognitive dissonance here. I think people acknowledge that aging is a thing, but sort of much like the attitude within aging biology, there's a sort of wider social attitude that aging is just this inevitable process that you can't do anything about. And there's certainly this sort of checkered history of pill peddling quacks who've had these various elixirs of life and these ridiculous treatments like sewing monkey testicles to people. That genuine proposed anti-aging treatment.
I waste a lot of money on that one.
Just to be absolutely clear, that does not work. It's not good for you. It's not good for the monkey. So there's this history of it just being quackery. I think people see it as inevitable. There's sort of there's a stigma around talking about it, because people think that you want to live forever, or people think that you're somehow vain, or there's this beauty industry as well around anti-aging. So people think it's related to that. There's this whole sort of concoction of different things that means if I go and give a talk and say I want to cure cancer, while scientists would quibble with that and say, cancer's loads of different diseases in it, can we ever really meaningfully cure it? What does that even mean? I feel like that's a goal that most people, perhaps with some caveats if you're a nerd, would get behind. Whereas if I, go and give a talk and say I want to cure aging, I get loads of hands, sticking up saying, oh, what about the ethical issues? What about overpopulation? If we have loads of people living longer, what about, aren't only the rich going to have access to this treatment? Currently, rich people do have better access to cancer treatment than poorer people do, whether we're talking within countries or globally. And yet nobody at the end of a cancer research talk sticks their hands up and asks, what are we doing about the fact these are only available to rich people? That isn't to say it's a question we shouldn't be answering. It's just fascinating that aging biology is people immediately ask far more of these ethical questions than they do of other fields of science. So that's a very sort of long-winded answer to your question, but I just feel like people don't see aging as this thing that causes diseases and we can do science and we can treat. They see it as this entirely separate thing, which they just put in a totally different moral, social, ethical, funding, scientific category. And I think that's why I want to raise awareness of this stuff. It's why I want to show people, whether or not they sort of understand every last nitty-gritty bit of the science. We have dozens of ways to slow aging down. We aren't just making animals or people live longer, we're making them live longer in good health. We're preventing all of these diseases, all the things that kill us, all the nasty, things that we've all got waiting for us in our future if we aren't already suffering from them ourselves. And that's what really needs this sort of mindset change of people understanding. And I think then the funding might be starting to flow.
I mean, do you think it's almost very ingrained in our culture that you die at a certain time? And kind of all the main world religions seem to be kind of based around that, or obviously they offer one answer to that. It's not an answer I find that convincing, but it is a answer. I mean, do you think that's the kind of, we're dealing with centuries of kind of cultural and religious traditions that have to be overcome?
I think so, and I think what's really fascinating to me about that is that we've got very used to current life expectancy, even though it's a really transient phenomenon. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, if we were to take a time machine back 200 years, life expectancy was probably about 30 or 40 years old, depending on where you lived in the world. That's a slightly unrepresentative statistic. It's not that everyone lived 40 years and suddenly fell off a cliff. It's because there was also enormous infant mortality. So, there were, and child mortality, I should say. So, there were people, you only had basically a 50-50 chance of making it to the end of your teenage years. But if you did make it to the age of 20, you'd probably live to your 40s or 50s or 60s. It's not as though you'd suddenly drop off a cliff age 33. However, the fact that we all have, in the rich world at least, life expectancy is around 80 years old now. We've all really internalised that as though that's been the case forever. But actually that just isn't the case, because if you even look back 50 years ago, life expectancies were probably 1 or 2 decades shorter, depending on the rich country that you look at. And we just internalised it as though 80 years is somehow our natural, human lifespan. That's what's fair, that's what's, equal, that's how the world should be, as well as how it is. And therefore, if you ask people in surveys, how long would you like to live? What most people say is probably about the life expectancy in their country plus about 10 years, because everyone wants to have a good innings. No one wants to fall over dead of a heart attack at 65. But I'd like to live to 90. I wouldn't like to live much longer than that, because that's weird or kooky, or actually in quite large part because people assume it's going to be in poor health. You'd like to make it to 90, feeling reasonably well, die of a heart attack in your sleep painlessly. That's sort of the perfect life for a lot of people. But if you instead ask people, how long would you like to live, assuming that we could extend your health perfectly? And by the way, that's more akin to what we would be looking at if we were able to treat aging. If we were even able to cure aging, you could live for much, much longer in good health. That's what we're really asking about. Then a substantial number of people want to live to 120 or even beyond. So I think there's it's a really, really hard thing to unpack, but I think people have got a load of preconceptions. They sort of imagine what is now the case is somehow natural and has always been the case, which just isn't true. Even if nothing happens with aging biology, it's quite likely that we're going to add about 2.5 years a decade to human life expectancy. So kids born today can probably expect to live into their hundreds if nothing dramatic happens. So yeah, it's a really hard one to unpack, but I think you're right that we're effectively fighting this sort of weird maelstrom of centuries of prejudice combined with people thinking that what's happening now is exactly how it's always been. It's a strange sort of cauldron of psychology.
Yeah. I mean, do you kind of think that future generations will look back and, having a life expectancy of 80 or whatever, in much the same way that we look back at an infant mortality rate of 50% and just as something utterly barbaric and, how did you put up with it type thing?
I think they will. I think, why there's nothing special about living 80 years, right? And I imagine that we do cure aging and, someone's in the year 2400, they're a 250-year-old. They'll think, wouldn't it have been awful? And I think this is something that I often use this as an example when people say, shouldn't we, isn't it necessary that we die? Doesn't death give life meaning or provide some kind of motivation for you to, achieve your greatest work or something like that? I just find that utterly baffling, because you could have made exactly that same argument in the 1850s. If I'd been, writing my book about, I've got this crazy zany idea about how we're going to deal with tuberculosis, and, someone reads the book and comes to one of my talks and sticks their hand up at the end and say, but isn't death by tuberculosis a wonderful thing that sort of it's the end of your life at the age of 35 with some horrible infectious disease that gives it meaning. It's what motivates you to write great works of poetry and literature and found companies and create a family. No, it's none of those things. And I really feel like if you sort of extend that perspective into the future, exactly as you say, someone in the year 2400 looking back, on their 2 centuries of lifespan is going to think, my God, that last century and a half, I've achieved loads of things. I've given my life loads of meaning. I've had fun. It would have been, a waste if I just died at 80 in some horrible way. So I think, we're really sort of, we've got a huge status quo bias, and whether or not we go on to cure aging, I really think that's something we should aim for. And because we've got to sort of break free of this bias toward how the world is now.
This is a very kind of specific question, UK specific question, but JPPG for longevity, which I think launched in 2019, does that cover the kind of stuff you're interested in, or is it mainly interested in how to help people live kind of healthier and well, not healthier, but sort of be more comfortable in their old age?
I think it's more the latter, to be honest. I went to, in fact, one of the last mass gatherings I went to before the pandemic kicked off was in February of last year, and I just look back on it with horror at the sort of hundreds of these aging biologists and policymakers all crammed into this tiny lecture theatre listening to talks. But what really struck me about that afternoon is technically aging biology is within the remit of the APPG, but they talked far more about things like assistive living, things like apps. If you could get a tablet that could help someone, an app that could help someone with dementia, find their keys or get around the house a bit more easily or whatever it is. These things are really, really important questions, but I just really worry that a lot of discussion of aging, about our aging populations, of what we can do about them, really focus on these far more sort of, they're almost palliative solutions, right? It's not palliative, isn't quite the right word, but it's treating the symptoms. It's trying to make sure that people are as comfortable as possible, people can live as easily as possible given the problems that they have. But Richard Farragher, who's an aging biologist who works down in Brighton, gave a brilliant answer to, I can't remember if it was an evidence hearing for them, I think it was with the Lord's Science and Technology Select Committee, who did an inquiry on aging biology recently. And he said that this focus on sort of assistive living and stuff, you could make an analogy that you could go back to a period just before the polio vaccine was developed. And it's like, having a scientist on one side saying we should really put some money into, finishing off this vaccine and making sure it works. And another group of scientists saying what we should do is, get some of these car companies involved and build the world's greatest fleet of iron lungs. And it's absolutely clear which side of the divide we should have gone for. The vaccinations have saved millions and millions of lives. We've almost got to the point where we've eradicated polio throughout the world. But instead of looking at the root cause, treating the biology that causes people to become frail, causes them to lose their memory, lose their ability to get around and be independent around the house, we're instead trying to help them in small ways. And I just think the real prize is to try and do something about the biology of aging rather than this sort of more social stuff. Not to say that isn't important, but that definitely seems to be an easy distraction where a lot of the focus is.
I mean, how kind of radically do you think it would change our society if we did have significantly expanded lifespans? Or perhaps not even if we had them, if we had the expectation of having them. I mean, for example, would everyone be much more risk avert because you don't want to get hit by a semi truck when you're going to live for possibly hundreds of years? I mean, kind of leaving out mind uploading and that kind of level of stuff. I mean, how do you think it would change the way we live?
I think it would change the way we live less than people think. And the reason for that is that I imagine my life as it is at the moment. And obviously I'm young, I'm in relatively good health, I'm pretty fortunate. But I don't, on a day-to-day basis, thankfully, consider my mortality. It's not like when I decided to write this book, I was doing it because death was bearing down on me, or even because I knew that I was going to start aging in, decades and decades time. And, when you ask someone out on a date or, go for a job interview or whatever it is, or, take up a new hobby, decide to have kids, although there might be some sort of idea of the sort of broad arc of your life in the back of your mind, most of these decisions are taken, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year.
Talking about death goes down badly on dates. I think I'll agree.
Yeah, it's good. On a first date, I'm here because I'm worried I'm going to die, so I'm really hoping this is going to get start off on a good note.
I've got about 5 years left to reproduce.
Yeah, I just feel like. so let's get on it. Go. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah, I just really feel like people do, we all live our lives on a relatively short-term basis, more or less. And I can imagine, continuing to live my life in that way indefinitely, effectively. Like, I've got plenty to do. I've got loads of stuff I'm fascinated in. I'd love to, read more, learn more, take up new hobbies, travel new places. And if you imagine, in hundreds of years' time, what experiences are there going to be that we don't have now? I might be able to go on holiday on the moon. We might have incredible immersive virtual reality that allows you to experience almost anything. I just find it incredibly unlikely that I'd get bored over that period. I'd run out of things to do. So I feel like in that sense, things won't change very much. I think in terms of the risk aversion, that's a really good question. And it's often framed, and I don't think you quite did this, but it's often framed in a similar way to how you did it in a negative way, to say, won't that mean that we never try anything new anymore, or we stop exploring because there's a risk that we might die. I think the flip side of that is that actually, things like road safety, they're a massacre. People are being killed on the roads. It's absolutely incredible how many people we accept being killed on the roads, or how many people we accept being killed in things like wars. And the basic reason I think that we accept those is because, if someone dies on the road or dies in war and they're 30, it's a tragedy. They've lost 30 or 50 years of life. But if we're going to lose centuries of life, then I think suddenly, war is going to seem a lot less acceptable. We're going to have to do a lot more about, making sure those self-driving cars come online ASAP and making sure they're super safe and so on and so on. Making sure that pandemics aren't such a risk anymore because we don't want someone to lose, potentially huge quantities of life by dying of an infectious disease. So I think that although it probably will lead to some risk aversion, actually for most people in the population, that's going to be a positive thing because it's going to mean that the world's a safer and more pleasant place to live.
I mean, so from what I was reading about from your book, is very interesting. Is I mean, they're kind of almost. It seems to be the two areas that you're looking at, and so obviously the kind of the final solution is a terrible expression, but the long term answer is gene editing. But I presume that may require some quite big advance in artificial intelligence to have that sort of that practical. So in terms of kind of things which are going to happen before then, what kind of the mid steps that we should be looking at?
There's actually quite a lot that's going to happen, and this is a really interesting question. Actually, the way you framed it, I say that in the book, and this is a sort of, as a scientist, I hate giving like hard numerical timelines, right? And that's because these things are basically impossible to predict in any meaningful way, and so journalists hate me, and that's I'm just going to have to live with that. However, my bet hedging and yet exciting sort of claim is that a lot of this stuff is going to happen in time for most people alive today. So let's unpack what I mean by that and why it's okay to be vague and yet still excited about it. There is some stuff that's going to happen in the really near term. So there are some ideas to repurpose existing drugs, and a classic example is something called metformin, which is a diabetes drug. There's some really good evidence that it might slow down aging in humans. It seems to be a bit preventative of cancer, and it actually looks like diabetics who are taking metformin live a little bit longer than non-diabetics who aren't. So just to unpack that a little bit, you know, a diabetic is someone, they're usually a bit overweight, they've often got other what are called comorbidities, so you know, other diseases, and yet if you give them metformin, which is normally just given as a drug to control their diabetes, it seems to make them live longer overall. So that's a really exciting result. And what we don't know is, does it make people who haven't got diabetes live longer? So the next thing to try is a proper randomized trial, test it out in some people who are, you know, over the age of 60 who are basically just old. There's nothing in particular wrong with them. And see if they get fewer diseases, see if they live longer. We'll know the answer to that in the next, 3 to 5 years, because this trial has actually been delayed a bit due to COVID, unfortunately. But I think it's due to start soon. And if that works, that is a drug that's got a huge safety record. That's part of why it's been chosen. It's been prescribed in the UK since the 50s. It costs pence per dose, so we could roll that out instantly. Yeah. And it's probably not going to double our lifespans, and it might add a few months or a few years. So it's maybe something that's worthwhile doing. That's not going to transform the world, but that's coming soon. And then what that'll do is that'll lay the groundwork, the regulatory framework that allows drugs to be licensed for use against aging. Something that we haven't talked about yet, but I think is one of the most promising sort of proper anti-aging drugs is something called a senolytic drug. That's a drug that kills senescent aged cells. And we've given these drugs to old mice. We basically found it makes them biologically younger. It kills those aged cells in their body. They live longer, they get less cancer, they get fewer cataracts, they get less heart disease, they can run further and faster, they can hang off a rope for longer, they do all these kind of bizarre physical experiments on the mice. They're even more curious, so you put them in a maze. Young mice tend to sort of scurry around the new environment, try and have a little look around. Older mice tend to be more anxious, a bit less, bit less eager to check out what's going on. And yet, if you give them these senolytic drugs, it makes them younger in that respect too. It even gives them better fur, so it reverses the cosmetic signs of aging as well. So what this is showing us is that by targeting these senescent cells, you've got this really global reversal of the aging process. And the reason this is so exciting is because we already have human trials going on. The first human trial of a senolytic started in 2018, and I think there are now 20 or 30 companies trying to turn the idea of killing senescent cells from a sort of dream of the lab bench, something that works in mice, into something that happens in the clinic. This is one of the areas where there's a lot of venture capital and sort of early stage funding going into the biotech side of things, not just the stuff that's going on in labs. So we could know where the senolytics work within the next few years. Sorry.
No, that was fascinating. I mean, do you almost feel we're kind of on the verge of a kind of breakthrough in which it kind of breaks into public consciousness? So I noticed in your book you use the analogy of the internet, which I thought was really interesting, and you were kind of saying that we're where the internet was, say 30 years ago, and at some point some event will happen, or do you think it'll be more a gradual thing, or just very, very slowly people become aware of it?
It's an interesting question. So I'm sorry that previous answer was very, very long, and the reason was you actually segued quite nicely into what I was going to say next, which is I think it will be gradual, and the question of whether it will reach public consciousness sooner is a really fascinating one, because these senolytic drugs, we'll know whether they work in the next few years. And what will probably happen is that at first they'll be approved for specific diseases. So we know that senescent cells are really heavily responsible for certain diseases, like lung fibrosis is a good example, which is a disease that commonly afflicts older people. And we know that senescent cells are often found near the sites of this fibrosis in the lungs. So we'll give older people these drugs. If they're effective in the trials, they treat the lung fibrosis. And most importantly, if they're safe, that means that we can then go on to give them, hopefully to just regular people who haven't got anything quote unquote wrong with them other than the fact that they were born a long time ago. So they might be in their 50s, they might be in their 60s. They've accumulated enough of these senescent cells that they're at risk of disease, but they're not currently suffering from one. Yeah. And so that means you could prevent them from getting cancer, prevent them from getting heart disease, all that stuff in the first place. Now, that's going to potentially happen. That could happen in the next 5 or 10 years quite easily if senolytics work for specific diseases and we become confident enough to roll them out more widely. What that then means is, you're taking your metformin, you're taking your senolytics, you might be taking a couple of other things that come along in the next decade. That means you can live a bit longer in good health. The question is whether that will, cause this thing to break through in the public consciousness. I hope so, because these will be the first examples of drugs that we give to people who are, we already give things like statins preventatively, but you have to have some kind of predisposition to something like heart disease, for example, to be given a statin preventatively. However, if we're giving out metformin or a senolytic preventatively, you might not have to have any indication at all. You might just go to your doctor and they'll be like, okay, you're 56, that's the cutoff that we've chosen, therefore you're going to start on your metformin now, sir. And that's going to be a bit of a transformation and sort of show us that you can use drugs to target the aging process. So my real hope is that will, begin to catalyze this whole process. But the reason it might be more gradual is because I think that the way that we're going to cure aging is ultimately going to be the sort of death, or rather life, by 1,000 cuts. So it's going to be the case that, you take your metformin, you take your senolytics, you live 5 or 10 years longer. Perhaps that's optimistic, but let's just say it for the sake of argument. What that means is that you're going to get a little bit of extra time in good health. Yeah. And that means you've got more time for the more advanced stuff, the gene therapies, the stem cell therapy to be developed. And then if you get one of these first generation gene therapies, it might not be perfect. Maybe we could optimize it with a bit more computing power, a bit more, understanding of the biology, but it might give you another few years. And what that means is that you then got another few years for scientists to develop the next treatment, and so on and so on. And what this means is that, it's not going to be the case that, suddenly one day someone invents some cure, we're all going to start popping this pill and we'll all suddenly live forever. It means that it's probably going to be this very gradual process where you'll start off thinking perhaps you'll live to 100 because that's how long people in your generation are projected to live. Then you'll take a few of these drugs and slowly your death sort of recedes further and further into the future, and more things are developed and your death recedes further and further into the future still. And I think that's how aging is ultimately going to be cured. So I think it's going to be very hard to draw the line and say, okay, we cured aging in 2042 or we cured aging in 2087. Because in 2087, when you exceed this threshold, you're not going to have cured it. You're going to have a collection of treatments which can extend people's lives by a certain amount. But what will happen is that in 2091, another treatment will be developed which will extend it a bit more. And in 2091, you might be really scratching your head. Have we cured aging? We might be close. But you won't actually quite know until, potentially even decades or centuries after you actually did pass the point. So it's a really fascinating question as to when it's going to enter the public consciousness and when we should start getting excited. And that depends both on, the absolute risk of when the treatment's going to get produced. We just don't know the answer to that. But it also depends on how confident are you that future treatments that are better are going to be developed quickly enough to mean that you can live even longer. Yeah. So it's that's why I never commit myself to timelines. But it's also why I'm really excited that, if you're in relatively good health today, some of this stuff is going to arrive in time for you, and potentially quite a lot of it if your life can be extended by those first few treatments.
Because that's a kind of a longitudinal escape velocity kind of argument. I mean, if presumably that means that our generation could be both. I mean, let's say I'm in my late 20s, so we're not a million miles away. Our generation could be sort of either the luckiest or the unluckiest in history, in a certain extent. Either we're going to jump along, along a series of new health, designs and just get there, or we're going to just miss out and be kind of the last or one of the last generations of.
Yeah, it's a strange time, isn't it? And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm so keen to raise the profile of this, because, it's very tempting to frame it in terms of mortality. But the way that I always think about this is just the sheer amount of suffering that we could avert, right? Because 2/3 of deaths globally, this isn't just in the rich world, this is in all the countries around the world, are caused by aging. And if you think about what people die of when it comes to aging, they're dying of dementia, they're dying of cancer, they're dying of heart disease. These are all things that slowly rob your independence over decades. Because, when you get heart disease, you don't normally just, you're perfectly well and then you suddenly have a heart attack and you're dead the next 10 minutes later. Yeah. Normally, your heart slowly starts to fail. You get less able to move. You get less able to do a bit of exercise at first. Maybe you're less able to play with your grandkids. It might get to the point where you have trouble getting up the stairs or just doing basic stuff around the house. these things are such a nasty way to go. And that's before you think about the sort of non-death, non-disease stuff that we don't really give a clinical diagnosis to, but things like the frailty, things like loss of memory or loss of hearing. You might get a hearing aid, but it's probably not going to bring you back up to the level that you were when your ears were working like a young person's. And all of these things mean that, although you talk about those 2/3 of deaths, and although we talk about extending lifespan, what I really care about is eradicating all that suffering. And because we've got the potential, we're on this cusp of huge decreases in the amount of suffering around the world. We've just got to push for it, because we really are at the point where our generation could be a pivot. Maybe it won't be our generation, maybe it won't be the next generation. I'd be astonished though if I came back in the year 2400 and we haven't made substantial inroads against aging. And so we're clearly at a point in history where I think we're at the first point in history where we can seriously discuss this. And so it'll be absolutely foolhardy not to.
I mean, of all the kind of the technology you talk about, I mean, gene editing seems the most controversial, or at least the one that kind of seems to raise the most ethical concerns. I mean, presumably, if you can, alter genes to take out bad stuff and put in good stuff, etc., you can alter them to do almost anything if the science is advanced enough, etc. I mean, what's the way to stop that being abused? We need some very strong kind of government regulatory system, or?
I think so, and I think there's also an attempt, and it's easy to overstate how much you know about genetics, and it depends. I think we're sort of fortunate scientifically in a way that some of the most controversial stuff is some of the stuff we know the least about. So in the book, I talk about gene editing in some sort of really simple, low-hanging fruit we could take. So, for example, there's this gene called ApoE, and it's a gene that we know comes in 3 different flavors, 2, 3, and 4. And if you always have 2 copies of any given gene, you have one from your mum and one from your dad. If you have 2 copies of ApoE4, you're massively at increased risk of heart disease, you're at massively increased risk of dementia. Yet if you have 2 copies of ApoE2, we think that's the most protective version. And actually, ApoE3 is the most common one. So most people watching this will have, 2 copies of ApoE3. You might have 1 copy of 2 or 4, if you're lucky or unlucky, respectively. Anyway, that's all a long sort of explanation to say, if you have ApoE4, we could send in some gene editing tool, something a bit like CRISPR, that can swap out a single letter of DNA. And actually the difference between ApoE4 and ApoE3 is a single letter. So if we go in and swap that letter, we can and we can do so in enough cells. And it might not have to be all cells, because one of the problems with some gene editing is that you have to hit literally every cell in the body, which is a huge technical challenge. But if we could just hit a significant number of cells and remove that ApoE4, we could potentially reduce your risk of dementia, reduce your risk of heart disease. But that is such a simple gene edit, right? That's a single letter. We've got pretty solid evidence about what that gene does. And so it's relatively uncontroversial, it's something that's hopefully going to make people better, assuming that we can get it right. However, when you start talking about the more controversial stuff, like, could we edit ourselves to, be hugely faster or stronger or more intelligent? Actually, the number of genes that contribute to intelligence is vast. And more than that, there's a lot of controversy around what's called germline gene editing, which is where you change the genetics of an egg cell before it turns into a baby. In a sense, that might be the simpler way to do it, because when you try and sift through genetics to work out what is it that's the genetics of intelligence, we find these hundreds of different places in the genome that seem to be relevant. We don't know how they're relevant, by the way, so it's not as though we can judiciously change a few of them and somehow converge on more intelligent kids. But then if you're looking at adult gene editing, it's just not clear at all, like what on earth you would change the genetics of an adult human being to try and make them cleverer, because a lot of what goes on to make us clever, or in whatever dimension, must happen during our developmental process, either in the womb or as a kid or as a teenager. So it's just wildly unclear how on earth we'd even begin to do those kinds of genetic edits. And I don't know when that's going to be physically possible. So in a way, the regulation sort of has this buffer zone, because the science is just too hard to do any of the really controversial stuff in the near term.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask was, do you find kind of people's attitudes vary depending whether they're religious or not? I mean, I suppose a better way of phrasing that would be, but do you think the anti-aging movement is at some point going to run into opposition from established churches? Because obviously, as we discussed earlier, they answer, they offer a solution to the age-long human terror of death, and you guys are starting to offer a sort of different solution. I mean, do you find a difference in attitude, or is it not as pronounced as you might think?
I've not noticed that, but I haven't spoken to any people with particularly evangelical or extreme religious views about this. I think the survey data, there have been some surveys of this, and I think it suggests the difference isn't as large as you'd think, and it's for much the same reason that more moderate Christians, for example, I know there are certain extreme parts of Christianity that would say we shouldn't do anything about climate change. But actually, most Christians think that we've got some sort of duty of stewardship over the earth, and that, you know, therefore we should try and make the world a better place. And I think similarly, most Christians think we should try and improve life while we're alive. And if you frame the ethics of this, and I think this applies actually as much to religious as non-religious people, the reason that we place aging in a separate ethical category is that we don't see it, you know, we don't sort of speak of it in the same breath as other kinds of medicine. We don't think of it in the same way as curing cancer or curing heart disease. But actually, if you realise that basically, you know, curing aging is just an incredibly effective way to deal with cancer and heart disease and stroke and all these things that we'd be very happy to see removed individually, or frailty, or, you know, all these different things that individually, if I said I was going to cure them, most people, religious or not, would be happy with. I think once you've internalised that it's basically an extension of modern medicine, you'd be hard pressed to say, you know, we should treat cancer, dementia, heart disease and stroke, but we shouldn't treat one thing that could get rid of all of them. And as I say, I think that applies, you know, whether you're religious or not. As long as you want to make the lot of human beings while they're alive as, you know, pleasant and healthy and comfortable as possible, then there shouldn't really be any objection regardless of your viewpoint.
I mean, just one final question. I mean, if someone's watching this and, you know, they want to support the anti-aging movement, what can, beyond obviously buying your excellent book, and I'll put an Amazon link down in the description, what can they do to help?
I think the single most important thing is just to raise the profile of this stuff. It's to, you know, the reason I wrote this book is I want people to be talking about this in pubs and bars when that's safe, you know, safe to do again, dinner parties, etc. I really want this to be a topic of everyday conversation. I want people to understand that aging science is a thing. It's something that we can do something about. It's something that's going to have this huge humanitarian and economic impact. And then, you know, we need to campaign about this stuff. Like, if you feel able, maybe you could write to your MP, or, like, you know, try and have a chat with some policymakers, because if you're in a position to try and pull some levers and get some funding for this stuff, MPs, you know, when you talk to them about what sort of letters they get, it's almost always, you know, tedious conspiracy business. Sorry, not conspiracy, constituency business. I'm sure they do get some tedious conspiracy business as well.
I used to work with MP. There's plenty of conspiracy stuff.
You very rarely get a letter saying, hi, you know, I'm really fascinated by the biology of aging. I think this could have huge potential to, you know, transform, you know, take the UK to the front of the queue in terms of, you know, this emerging area of biotechnology. It could radically improve our healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. If you engage with them on this sort of national policy issues, it's something that's so rare. And it's just a question of, you know, that's just one example. We've got to really widen this conversation and draw in scientists and doctors and policymakers and, you know, people in the street, because that is really what the key to this is. We need to get more money into the field in order that the research can be done. And all of this, I just feel the best way to pull everything in the right direction is just for more people to be aware of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, say, Andrew, it's been a huge pleasure. It's a really interesting, really fascinating subject. Thank you so much for your time.